Hi everyone. In this lesson, we're going to sketch out ideas for making a 3D Triceratops sculpture. In a previous lesson, I had made this sketch, which I used to break down shapes, thinking about them as two-dimensional surfaces, because we designed a flat T-Rex Triceratops, and I'm going to take this same idea and think about it in three-dimensional terms. So if we take a look at our triangular shapes here for the horns, we can replace those with cones or the paraboloid shape, and our half circle here, instead of half of a cylinder, we can think of it as half of a sphere. And instead of cylinders, we can use spheres. So if we take this idea and think about it in 3 dimensions, we'll end up with a stretched out sphere for the body and another one on here for the head. And in order to make this beak shape, we'll have a curve here and our cut in half from a half circle here, or a half sphere. That will give us a 3-dimensional version of that flat shape. We'll add some cones, be the horns, more spheres for the eyeballs, and over here for our frill, we can use more half spheres. I think this guy is going to turn out pretty cute. We can put another cone on here for his tail, and to simplify his legs a bit, we'll keep them all straight down, either as cylinders or cones, so that they are round but have flat bottom. And we can use some half spheres again to make our toes here. Now that I've thought about the 3D shapes that I need, and we've taken our design and broken them down into simple shapes, I'm going to take my example here, move him out of the way, and start fresh. So all the details are in his head, and we're going to start his head off with a sphere. I'm going to turn the number of steps up on the sphere just so that it has a smoother appearance. And we're not going to change its size. So I'm going to use the default size of 20 millimeters as the basis for our design. So we're going to make a small figure. Now to give his head more of a shape than just a perfect sphere, I'm actually going to duplicate the sphere that I have, and then we'll squash that one down a bit from the top, and we can use the black handles in the center to stretch it out on the sides. But I want both sides to stretch out the exact same amount. So I'm going to hold down Alt on the keyboard, and we can stretch both sides out. So now I've got a shape for his head where he looks like he has some cheeks puffing out there. And for his beak, so that it is a little bit more beak shaped, I'm going to go down here and get a half sphere. So since this is already cut in half, which is a thing that we could do with a hole, but this just makes our job a little bit simpler. We're going to stick this in the front of his face, and I'm going to make the color match because it's just easier to see how we're expecting it to look. Now I'm just rotating my view around with the right mouse button, and I could also go up to the view cube here. If I wanted to click on right and look at it from the side. Now I can easily click on my up and down arrow here and raise it up so that it is sticking out of the front of his face. Right now, that's very wide. If we look at it from the front, it doesn't quite look right. So I'm going to use the same trick, hold down Alt, and I'm going to drag it in to make this a bit of a beak shape. And we don't want it to stick out quite so much, so we can move it back into the head, but it's easy if we click on it to accidentally move it off to the sides. So instead of that, I'm going to use the arrow keys and just nudge it. You can see that when I hit the arrow keys, it moves 1 millimeter at a time, and that's because our snap grid is set to 1. You can change this value, so you can change the amount that it moves each time you press the arrow key. Now that it's back in there, I'm going to rotate it while I'm looking at it from the side. And just keep the mouse inside of my circle so I can go 1 notch forward. I like to keep all of these things lined up to our notches because it makes it easier for me to go back if I want to change it back. Remember that if we move our mouse outside of the circle, we'll be able to rotate it any degrees that we want. But once we click away from it, we have no idea how far it has been rotated. So it would be very hard to get it back to straight if we want to line it up with something again. So let's undo that. And now that I rotated it, I gotta raise it up again. And I'll use the arrow keys to move it out and down a little bit. All right, so now we have his mouth, and we're gonna need some horns and some eyes. And for our eyes, we'll be using spheres. So I can click on the sphere that I already have here and duplicate it, or I can drag in a brand new sphere. If I drag in a new sphere, I just have to remember that I want to increase the number of steps to maximum so that it's smoother. If we turn the number of steps down, we can even get to the point where it doesn't look like a sphere at all. So let's take this one and we'll change it to a different color so we can see the eyes placement properly. And since I want it to stay perfectly round, I'm going to hold down Shift while I drag one of the handles to shrink it down. When you hold down Shift, you can see it scales in every direction at the same time, so it stays round instead of getting squashed. Let's make this a little bit smaller, and then let's put it near our head, and I'm going to use the Align tool to do that. So I'll hold down Shift and click on the central sphere of our head, and I'm going to click on the Align tool, or L on the keyboard, and we can see all of these align handles. But when I put my mouse over them, there's a little yellow representation of where it's going to move. You can see that this would move the head piece as well, which I don't want to do. Well, I'll undo that. I'm going to click on Align, and then I'm going to click on the shape that I don't want to move. So I'll click on the head, and now all of the align circles line up with the head. So now if I push the middle one here, our eye is going to raise up to the middle of the head, and I'll click on this corner here. So it's now lined up with the edge of the head, and it's pretty close to where I want it to be. Unfortunately, with Align, you only have a few options, putting it in the center or putting it on the edges. So now that it's here, I'm going to click on just my eye and use the arrow keys to move it until I have it in the right place. And I feel like his eye is a little bit too low. We're going to grab our up and down and raise it up, and then we're going to use our arrow keys to make sure that it is halfway into the head there. Next, I want to give him some expression with an eyebrow of some kind, and for that, I'm going to go down and use the torus. So, the torus by itself is shaped like a donut. You can also increase the number of sides or the number of steps to make it smoother. I'm going to shrink this down and line it up with our eyeball so that we can use just part of it to look like an eyebrow. So let's go ahead and hold down Shift, shrink this guy down, and hold down Shift and click on our eyeball. We're going to use our same Align tool trick, turning on the Align tool, and then clicking on the eyeball again so that the alignment goes there. And we're going to move our, oops, got to be careful. If we click on anything that's not the Align tool, we will turn off the Align tool. Let's go back, click on this, Shift, click on the eyeball, Align, click on the eyeball one more time. Now I can see, I'm going to click on the dots for center, center, and center. So now I've got our donut shape surrounding our eye, and I can start to rotate it to make it look like an eyebrow. So I will click on an empty space to turn off the Align tool, click on our eyebrow torus again, and then we will look at it from the side and click on our little rotate handle to tilt this up. Now if we look at it from above, we can rotate it once more. So it's now 45 degrees, and it is a little bit big. Kind of makes him a bit angry. So let's hold down Shift and drag this down a little bit to make our eyebrow a little smaller. And then I will keep on experimenting with rotating it until I get it to look like I want it to. You'll find you'll have to rotate your view around each time to be able to see which direction you're rotating in. And I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I want to use my arrow keys to make it back up a little bit into the head. Well, that's pretty hard to see. When you get down to moving around little tiny amounts, you'll want to go to Snap Grid and change it. So I can stop going 1 millimeter and I can go half a millimeter, 0.5. Now, when I hit the arrow keys, it'll move back just a little bit. And now my eyebrow is perfectly in the head there, so I just get it right on the top of the eye. Well, now that I like how that looks, I'm going to change my Snap Grid back to 1 millimeter. This way it makes it easy to line everything up right on the ones instead of going half a millimeter by accident. And we're going to make an identical eye for the other side. So let's click on the eyebrow, hold Shift, click on the eye, and duplicate it. Now we've made an identical copy that's in the same place. And we're going to click on Mirror. And with the Mirror tool open, we can see which direction we're going to mirror it. We want to go left and right. And then we can go ahead and use our arrow keys to just move it over to the other side. All right, now that we have 2 eyes, we're going to need some horns. And right here next to the torus, we have the paraboloid. Paraboloid is a little bit pointy, but it has a nice curve to it, so it's not as sharp as a pyramid or a cone. Well, I like it for this dinosaur. Makes him look a little cuter and a little less dangerous. Now we're going to hold down Shift and shrink our paraboloid down until it looks like it's about right. And then we're going to raise it up, look at it from the side here, and let's try and move it into place. Since we know this should be right in the center, I can use the Align tool again by Shift clicking on the head, Align, click on the head once more, and put that horn in the center. Now we'll rotate it out. Let's raise this up and we'll hold Shift to make it a little bit smaller. And I think we'll need to rotate it one more step just so it's sticking out of the nose. Now that we have our first horn, we don't want to have to change the size of the next two. We can go ahead and duplicate it, and then we can move it over to where we think we want horn on the side. Now for this horn, because it's facing forward, and the head curves away, it's not going to intersect properly. We're going to have to look at it from the top and rotate it again. I'll turn it out 45 degrees, and we'll move it down until it intersects with the head. All right, looks great. Just like with the eye, we're going to duplicate it. Whoops. Now, because I duplicated one horn and I duplicated this one, it remembered, because this is duplicate and repeat, a thing I do many, many times every project. I'm going to delete my accidental repeat, make sure I have nothing selected, select the horn again, and duplicate it. If we click on something else, it will forget the steps that it wants to repeat, and then you can duplicate without repeating. But I want to duplicate in the same place so that I can do the same trick as the eye. Click on Mirror and flip it to the other side, and then use my arrow keys to just move it over to the opposite side. Now I've got all 3 horns and the head is looking good. Next we're going to finish off the head with this frill in the back. And for that, I'm going to go back down to the half sphere. We're going to use the half sphere to make this shape. I don't want it super round, so I'm going to grab the top here. Without holding Shift, I'm just going to shrink it down. Now we have curved shape, but it's a lot flatter than our sphere. And we're going to look at it from the side so that we can rotate it. And keeping our mouse inside the circle, we can snap it right to 90 degrees. So it's sticking right up from the head. And then we can use our Align tool to snap it to the back of the head. So let's hold down Shift, click on the head, Align, click on the head again. We'll put our frill in the center and on the back. So far, so good. Let's raise this up a little bit, and I think I want to move it a little bit forward. There we go. I'm going to add a couple of more circles on the sides here so that the frill extends all the way around. I could make one giant circle behind him, but I want to give it this bumpy, rounded look. So we're going to duplicate this, and we're going to use our arrow keys to move it over to the side, and then we're going to drag it down. You can also use your arrow keys to move things up and down. You just have to hold down the Control key we need to use the up and down arrow keys. Let's go ahead and select nothing, select our shape again, so we can duplicate it without repeating. And then I'll use my arrows to move it over to the other side. Now we have our shapes here. I don't want it to be round on the bottom. I want to cut this frill off. So we're going to add a hole here, but we only want it to cut the pieces of the frill and we don't want it to cut into the head. So we'll have to be careful about what we select. Go ahead and get this box shape here, and we'll drag this box down until it's just where we want to cut off our frill shape. Then we'll take this handle and drag it across. It doesn't have to match, it just has to be big enough to cover up the bottom that we want to get rid of. You can see everything that the hole intersects is shaded, but since we only want to cut our frill shapes, we're going to hold down Shift, select frill on this side, and select the frill on this side, and then we'll click on Group. Now we have cut the bottom off of that shape, added those together, and we haven't cut any of our rest of our head. Now that our head is completely done, I'm going to drag a box around this and click on Group. I'm grouping these parts separate from the rest of the body so that I don't have to worry about accidentally moving them and messing up where my eyes are on my head. If I want to see the colors that I picked, I can click on Solid here and turn on Multicolor. So now, let's give him a body and some feet. We're going to be making this guy out of spheres. So, grab another sphere here, turn our steps all the way up to make it as smooth as possible, and we'll go ahead and hold down Shift to pick the head, and we can align them in the center. Now I know that the body is centered to the head, so as long as I don't move it side to side, we're good. So let's grab our handles and stretch out the body so that it intersects with the head, and we'll make his body a little bit longer than that. And I think I want him to be a little chubbier, so we'll hold down Alt. This way we're going to move both sides at the same time, and we'll stretch him out a little bit so that he's wider, and I think we can make it a little bit taller too. All right, now his body comes to a little bit of a narrow point. I want the back side of him to be rounder, so I'm going to duplicate this sphere, and with the duplicate in the same exact place, I'm going to click on this handle and just shrink it so that it squashes this sphere sort of into the back. Now we can see that I have a rounder, not so stretched out sphere overlapping my other sphere. That makes the whole backside look rounder. Make it a little bit taller too. So now his body, rather than being just a sphere, is a little bit more of a bumpy shape. And you can add a lot of spheres overlapping each other to make a very different organic shape. But for him, I just want him to have one slightly chubbier butt. So with our body shape done, we're going to add a tail onto him. And for his tail, we'll use the same shape we did with the horns. Head down to find the paraboloid. I'll make it the same color as his body just so it matches. And we want to hold down Shift and shrink this down until it's about the size that I want for the tail. And let's make sure that it is centered. So we'll hold down Shift, pick a part of the body, and align. Click on the body again, and put it right in the center. I'll click on an empty space, and we'll click on the tail again and rotate it so that it is pointing out instead of pointing straight up. All right. Now he has a short stubby tail, and lastly, he's going to need some feet. So now that we have this shape, we're ready to add some feet. I'm going to go ahead and group them again. We'll select everything here and hit Group. You can add any number of groups together in Tinkercad. Just remember that if I want to go back and change the head, I'll have to ungroup it from the body and then ungroup the head again to get at the pieces inside of the head. So we have a group inside of a group, and we can put it inside of another group. It just means that if we want to change anything, we have a lot of ungrouping to do. So let's raise this guy up, and we'll decide how long we want his legs to be. We're going to plan for him to stand on the floor. So I think we'll put him at 10 millimeters off the floor. Remember that our basic sphere shape was 20. That means that his legs are going to be half the size of his head, which I think is good. Let's take the half sphere. I'm using the half sphere here because it is already perfectly flat on the bottom, and it gives our legs a nice curve instead of them just being straight. But if we wanted to, we could use a cylinder instead for legs, or really any other shape, as long as you make sure that the bottom is flat. Let's take our half sphere and stretch it up so that it's taller than the 10 millimeters. That way it's going to be stuck inside the body. And then we've got to make our foot size smaller. As we can see, we have 20 millimeters across for one foot. It's going to take up a lot of space. I'm going to hold down Shift and drag one of the corners in. This way it drags them all in at once. And we'll go ahead and stick with 10. See how that looks. Might be a little bit small. I'll make his foot a little wider than that. Now we just have to make it taller again so that it merges with the body. Just so I like how it looks, I'll change it to the same color. Let's move this in a little bit. The arrow keys. And I think that looks pretty good for his front leg. Maybe put it a little bit more forward. So now we've got our first leg, and it needs some details. I'm going to put some toenails on it, and to do that, I'm just going to use the same shape. So let's go ahead and duplicate our leg shape. We'll hold down Shift and shrink it down, and then I'll use the arrow keys to move it forward so I can see it sticking out of the front. And we'll change it to a different color, the same color as the horns. So now we can see it's a good toenail shape, and we'll go ahead and add another one. Remember that if I duplicate again, I'm going to do all the same moves again. So I'm going to go ahead and make a super tiny toenail on the end of the toenail, which can be useful for making a repeating pattern. Extremely tiny toenails, but not what I want to do right now. So let's click on nothing, click on our toenail again, duplicate it, and move it over to the side. Our second toenail isn't really stuck into the leg, so we'll move it back a bit, and that looks good. So now he's got his leg, his toes. We're going to go ahead and click and drag the box that just touches the toes and the leg, so we can select that without selecting the rest of the body. And you guessed it, I'm going to make another group. Now we'll go ahead and turn this to multicolor so I can see those toenails better. And we're going to use this guy to create all of the rest of the legs. So he's got his toenails facing outward. I'm going to want to duplicate it and then mirror it so that my other leg is flipped left and right. And then when I move it over to the side, we'll have our second leg facing outward as well. Now if you put them on facing straight ahead, or perfectly symmetrical, you won't necessarily have to flip it. And even though we've grouped this, we can always ungroup it. If we want all of our legs to be slightly different, you could change something about one of them at a time. But for me, I want them all identical. So let's go ahead and click and drag a box to select both of these guys. And I should be able to duplicate them and use my arrow keys to just move them back until they're in the right spot. All right, so now he's got his back legs and his front legs. Everything's in place. And I'm going to go ahead and drag a box around the whole thing and group it together. And there we have it. And we are going to set up Triceratops figure for printing. So first, we'll select and make sure our entire thing is grouped together as one object. We'll hit Export. Make sure we're only using the selected shape, so I don't want any other examples I have off to the side selected. And create an STL. And we'll open up our slicer, make sure we have the correct printer and the material that we have loaded set up, and then we are going to open our STL file. And we can see this guy is pretty small. We'll zoom in a little bit. So we should be a fairly fast print. We want to double check looking around using the right mouse button, see that the underside has blue highlights, which means that his feet are going to be touching the floor, which is what we want. But also red, which is areas that are overhanging that are going to require supports. Now, if we just look at this with our default settings, we could just turn on support and say that's probably enough and hit slice. But let's take a preview of this. So right now, it's a little over an hour, and it looks like we can very clearly see rings around the top of it. And because our faster profile here is 0.28, and that is the size of the layer height. So it is 0.28 millimeters. It goes up each time. And because he's made out of spheres, there's a lot of round, curvy shapes. You can clearly see a sort of step to each and every layer. That's going to make him appear pretty rough. Now I have the supports set on tree, but that's not the default here. So I will take a look at custom, show you what I mean by that. Let's head over and look at the supports, and we can take a look at the normal supports, which is what the default is. Normal supports are going to go straight down from every part that requires a support. And if we go down on layers, we can see that all in between the legs is filled in with this tower of support. And that might be a little bit more difficult to remove after we're done. So I'm going to turn on tree and try those, because the tree support makes a smaller base and grows out to fill the area. It should be easier to remove than the normal one. We're also going to go up to our quality or layer height, and we're going to change that. So I'm going to use the pre-made dynamic quality setting, which is 0.16 millimeters instead of 0.28, and we'll slice it again. Different printers will have different preset settings, but we can see that with a lot smaller layers, the individual steps that go up that were very clearly visible on the horn are not so visible anymore, which means when this is finished printing, and it's going to take 2 hours instead of 1, but when it's finished printing, all of these nice curved shapes that are part of his head are going to look a lot smoother and a lot more curved. Let's go down our layers, see how the tree attaches, and we can see here that this shape doesn't go out so much between each side, and it should be easier to remove it from underneath our finished part. I like how this looks, so I'm going to save the file, and we'll have the G code ready to upload to our printer.